This is the Therapy Chat Podcast with Laura Reagan, lcsw-c. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Laura Reagan, lcsw-c.
Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. I'm your host, Laura Reagan, and today I am really excited and honored to be speaking with my colleague and friend, Dr. Erin Kinney. Erin, thank you so much for being my guest on Therapy Chat today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I've, you and I are in the same local area, and I've known you and of your work for a while now, several years, and the holistic natural path isn't the most prevalent here, although there's a strong energy of people who are interested in integrative and functional approaches to healing. But having people in the local area who provide these important services, especially what we're going to be talking about, which is hormones and thyroid support and all of those things. I know for myself, it's been a lifesaver. So I really want our audience, which is mostly therapists and other people in the helping professions and people who want to heal. I want them to hear the importance of this because it's just not spoken about enough. So before we get into it though, let's just start off by you telling our audience a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I specialize in treating stressed out men and women with hormonal imbalances. And I've been doing it for almost 15 years. And I got into this line of work because when I was in my early 20s, I went through a period of severe depression. I couldn't get out of bed. I gained about 30 pounds. I was crying constantly. After several months, my parents were like, hey, you should go see your primary. I go to see my primary, and he, without even asking any questions, like, oh, you're depressed, and, pushed me a prescription for an antidepressant. And I left the office feeling really, really just down. I thought there's got to be something else. I had gone from being this like marathon runner in college, and I was super happy all the time. And I drastically changed my diet about a year before the depression hit. I'd become a vegan. And I was like, maybe there's like something clearly had to have changed. And so I was in therapy. I'm a big fan of therapy, always have been. And my therapist at the time, was kind of telling her what had happened. And she goes, I think you should go see this natural doctor. She's like, I'm not quite sure what he does. I had lunch with him last week, but he seems like he might be someone you want to talk to. So, and he's a guy that's still in practice. He's a good friend of mine. And at this point, I went to go see him. He ran a whole bunch of tests, tested all my nutrient levels, checked my hormones, looked at my adrenal glands, which we'll chat a lot about today. And when we got the results back, I was low in a bunch of nutrients. My hormones were completely out of balance, and I'll explain what that means. And I had what we call adrenal fatigue. So my cortisol levels were really, really low. I was basically depleted in every sense. So I worked with him for a few months, and after about 6 weeks, I was almost 80% better. I stopped crying. I started losing weight. I was able to get out of bed. I felt, hope again about life. I ended up quitting my job because through his counsel, I was not in a great job that I didn't like. And I went to go to a recruiting company to have them help me find a new job. And they ended up hiring me to do temporary recruiting. So I was like, well, this sounds cool. I got to interview people all day long. I love talking to people. I interviewed close to 100 people every day. Ooh. And about 6 months into the job, my boss sat me down and she's like, this isn't the right profession for you. And she was very good at, putting people in professions. And I'm like, what do you mean? Am I doing a bad job? And she's like, no, you're doing a great job. But you keep bringing me these resumes, and before you tell me about their job skills, you're telling me about their health. She's like, I would bring a resume and be like, listen to this woman. She had lupus and she had all these symptoms and she didn't leave her job because of this, this, and this. And the boss was like, I don't really care that she has lupus. I want to know if she can do the job, but you clearly do. So anyway, so at that point, I was like, maybe I should think about going back to med school. So I went and had lunch with the doctor who treated me. And I was like, how do I do this? What does this look like? And funny, he actually told me not to do it. He's like, it's going to be an uphill battle. No one knows what this is. You're going to have to run your own business. He's like, I don't know. It's not for everyone. And I was like, that sounds great. I love a battle. And
Give me a challenge.
So give me a challenge. So I didn't listen to him. And like I said, he's a good friend of mine. And I went back to naturopathic school. And now that's what I do. I help people that are feeling really low, depleted, and a little bit discouraged by Western medicine because they felt like they were just kind of brushed aside. And the majority of my patients that come in are typically at kind of their wit's end. They're like, I really don't feel good. I've either had a bunch of labs tested that look quote unquote normal, or my doctor has just told me it's just stress. You're just stressed. And the interesting thing about that answer is probably the stress is one of the reasons why you don't feel good, but we don't want to write it off. We don't want to be like, it's just stress. So, and a lot of what I do is I teach a lot. I teach my patients like what stress actually does to the physical body and how we can help unwind some of that. So the physical body isn't in such a reactive state. And there are things we can do. And, one of the biggest things that I think I teach is a lot of women will come in and they have maybe problems with their menstrual period. They're having PMS. They don't feel good. They might get something like PMDD where they're so low before their period. And they think, oh, this must be an estrogen, progesterone. Something is wrong with my sex hormones. Maybe something is wrong with the sex hormones, but the majority of the time, it's either a thyroid or it can be an adrenal issue. And this is because the majority of our hormones, with the exception of thyroid, they're all what we call steroidal hormones. So they're all similarly shaped and they have a similar makeup. And so, for example, your body, if it doesn't have enough cortisol, and I'll talk about cortisol in a minute, it will then, if it needs it to do something, to respond to stress, it will steal from your progesterone levels and it will shunt it over to cortisol. So we have this, what we call pregnenolone steal. So we'll get a drop in some of these sex hormones, but it's really not a problem with your ovaries. It's not a problem. It's really a problem with your adrenals. And when we have that low level of cortisol, it can be from chronic stress. And so cortisol, we think of it typically as the stress hormone. Usually when I teach and I ask, what do you think of when you first hear cortisol? Like, oh, stress, it's bad. We don't want cortisol. And we don't want too much cortisol, but cortisol really isn't entirely the stress hormone. It's really the hormone your body makes to give you energy to deal with stress. So it's really more of an energy hormone. It's what wakes you up in the morning. When you wake up in the morning naturally because you got enough sleep, it's the peak of cortisol that gets you out of bed. And when you've had a good night's sleep and you wake up and you're ready to take on the day, that energy, that's from cortisol. So the other thing that cortisol does, and it's a really, really important molecule, it's our body's natural steroid. So if you've ever taken prednisone or a steroid because your body can't handle something, you have a rash that gets out of control, or you get bronchitis that your airways can't, something similar like that. It's typically prednisone works because it's giving your body like a bunch of cortisol. Your body naturally uses cortisol to reduce inflammation in the body, just like prednisone would. So again, it's really important to have cortisol. And similar to blood sugar, to glucose, we don't want too much. Too much cortisol will cause problems, but too little cortisol causes arguably even more problems. And the majority of the patients that I see, they come in and they know, hey, I'm really stressed. And they know that stress has had an impact on how they're feeling. And when we go over their labs, I'm like, okay, here's your cortisol level. It's really, really low. And they're like, what? I thought my cortisol levels would be high. I'm like, no, actually they're low. And that's why you're tired. And that's why your hormones are. So in today's world, most of us have been chronically stressed, particularly in the last few years, given what we've all been through.
Absolutely.
But even like I have some patients that will come in, and they'll tell me, I'll ask about their stress levels and they'll say, well, I'm not stressed. They'll say like, I've got enough money. I've got a great job. My kids are great. But just the pace of life that they live at is stress to the body. And, your body, the type of stress doesn't matter. It could be a child screaming in your back seat. It could be an email from a boss. It could be someone almost hit you in a car. You might have varying amounts of hormones produced based on the intensity, but stress is stress is stress. You will get the same exact physiologic response when there's a stressor presented to the brain. And you guys all probably know this process really well, but the amygdala sends out we need to go into fight flight. This is something that's stressor. It sends a signal to the hypothalamus that pumps out cortical releasing hormone, which then goes to the adrenals. And it's like, hey, adrenals, make some cortisol and some adrenaline. We need energy to respond to this. But what's supposed to happen, and here's where kind of like the nuance or I think the most important part is once your body is safe from that acute stressor, once that's dealt with, that same cortisol molecule is supposed to go back to the hypothalamus, and there's a receptor there. It's called a glucocorticoid receptor. And that, I like to call it the off button. That cortisol will bind to that receptor, and that turns off further production of cortisol. So the cortisol, the hormone that gives you energy and the quote unquote stress hormone that turns you on, it's actually the same hormone that actually turns that stress response off and allows you to go back into your parasympathetic state. But what will happen is if you consistently push the stress trigger. So I love to use the example of March of 2020. We all remember that really fun month, right? Where our amygdalas were getting triggered every 10 minutes. Like, this is happening, this is happening. So your body, being as wise as it is, it will sometimes downregulate the production of that off button, because it's like, I'm not sure why I would turn off. She's just going to turn me back on 5 minutes from now. So I'm going to stay pumping out cortisol because she needs it. She needs this right now. And, and almost when you're in that state, and everyone's probably been in a state like this, you're going through kind of a longer set of stress, whether it was the pandemic, or maybe you're going through a move, or you have a new job, or you're going through a divorce, or any sort of big, life change. The body will protect you, and it keeps you in that, right? It's a protective mechanism. It's like, hey, I'm going to keep you up, energy, on alert. But again, if we don't make those receptors anymore, and this is very similar to how someone develops type 2 diabetes, when we stop making insulin receptors, your body will just consistently be pumping out cortisol to keep you up, which is fine. And your body can keep that up for a certain amount of time. But what will happen is, I like to say that cortisol is a very metabolically expensive molecule to make. All steroidal hormones are. It takes a lot of energy for the body to build them. And if you're in chronic fight-flight state, and you're not resting, guess what? Your body's going to eventually run out of what it needs to build more cortisol. So I kind of like to use this currency analogy. I like to explain to my patients that let's pretend cortisol is the currency in which your body uses to do just about anything. It gives you energy to do things. It's going to allow you to fix things in your body. It's the currency your body needs to spend on life. When you sleep at night, or when you rest, that is when you earn said currency, or the cortisol, right? When you do anything else, you're spending it. So if you go through a time of a high spend rate and you're not sleeping very much, what will happen, right? And everyone knows this, everyone who's balanced a budget. If you spend more money than's coming in, you will go into debt. And so what tends to happen, and this is why most of my patients' cortisol levels are low, is that they were in a prolonged period of time where they were pumping out so much cortisol. And now the body's like, I don't have much of that. I don't have much going on. And then in terms of our other hormones, again, I explained that, where the progesterone gets shunted to cortisol, your body will essentially start to rob Peter to pay Paul. It will steal from the other sex hormones in order to keep cortisol levels in a normal range. If you don't have enough cortisol, if it gets below a certain level, you cannot get out of bed. And I'm sure, everyone listening, you may know someone who has, chronic fatigue syndrome. Typically, chronic fatigue syndrome is extremely, extremely burnt out adrenals. They make no cortisol and they can't do much. And that's kind of when that, like, if your body were a bank, this is the other part of the analogy I use, is, when we first are tired and we have to go through the day, we drink caffeine, right? Or we take a stimulant. That's basically like spending money on a credit card. And like any bank, they'll let you take out a loan, but there will come a point where
you're going to pay a price for it, though.
If you don't pay the money back, the bank is eventually going to be like, I'm sorry, we're not going to give you any more loans. You better just rest. And so it was kind of a very long-winded opening to this conversation.
That's okay. I'm right here with you, but I want to ask you something. So I'm dying to say something when you're ready.
No, go for it. It's a good stopping point.
Okay. Well, if it's okay, I'd like to tell you a little bit about something that I went through. I wasn't expecting to bring this up, but it just matches up so much with what you're talking about. And I think it could kind of frame our discussion a little bit more specifically to something that I know a lot of the listeners will be seeing in their clients too, and probably experiencing themselves, which is for myself. I want to talk about being a child and living in a chronically stressful situation, like being abused or not having enough food or not enough safety, not security, where you knew, things were chaotic and you just never really knew what was going to happen. And most of that does describe some of the things that I went through when I was a kid, but also a very important loss, an attachment loss that I had when I was 6. My mom left, and So that was something that's always like under the surface. I was still safe. I still had other people. She was still in my life. She still loved me. So I had, like almost enough of what I needed, but not really completely what I needed. And fast forward, I become a therapist. I'm striving, pushing, building my private practice, getting my master's degree, building my private practice, learning about trauma, blah, 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 blah. Raising kids. Oldest child goes to college. And I see this in so many of my own clients that when their first kid goes to college, suddenly the attachment injuries burst back onto the scene. So it was like in the same summer, my dog died and my oldest went to college, and suddenly I gained 40 pounds and I couldn't get out of bed. And I was like, what's wrong? What's happening? Like, I've already prepared for this. I knew this was coming. I've been, I'm in therapy. I'm not ignoring how this could be impacting me. I know because of the loss in childhood that this is going to be hard for me, but at the same time, I'm very, like having this whole physiological experience that I can't explain. I don't understand. And then I go to the doctor. I start having these hot flashes, go to the doctor, and regular Western medicine doctor. Oh, well,
You might be perimenopausal.
You are 43.
Yeah.
You might be, heading towards menopause. Yeah. And also, maybe if you lose some weight, that'll help. And I'm like, come on. In May, I was fine. And in August, I'm like unable to get out of bed. Something's not right. This doesn't make sense. Also the time that I launched the podcast, by the way. So, yeah. But it was like I was having the hormonal symptoms of, like, I was having thyroid issues symptoms. I was having female hormone issues, the weight gain, the fatigue. I had everything you said. So can you talk about how the like trauma piece, or the thing that makes it like go over the edge, fits in to the extent that it within your scope?
Sure. So this is like kind of the analogy that I like to teach, or kind of the way I like to teach hormones is, so imagine you've got a triangle. We've got video, right? So you see, I've got my hands in a triangle, and you have 4 major players in your endocrine or your hormonal system. You have the thyroid, you have your sex hormones, you have the adrenals, which I just talked about, and you have blood sugar. The triangle is made up of thyroid, adrenals, and sex hormones. So if you think about a triangle, if any one of those moves up or down, it's going to affect where the other one is. So if you have either elevated cortisol or too low cortisol, it's going to affect the thyroid and your sex hormones. And so in a case like what you went through, your fight flight was getting triggered multiple levels, right? You were getting re-triggered. So it was putting you back into that state, which was putting a lot of stress on your adrenals. Now, I don't know what your adrenal state was like going into that. Either you could have gone into hyperadrenal, so your cortisol could have been high during that period, which typically when cortisol goes high, it crashes the thyroid out. It can also have an impact on the sex hormones. Similar, your cortisol could crash out this way. It's going to have an impact on the thyroid and the sex hormones. So typically that something, and this we see commonly happen in the 40s decade of life, right? And for women, that's usually we have children, we might have aging parents, we have our careers going on. It's a big decade. There's a lot going on. And I don't necessarily agree with when women are told when they're 42 years old, you're perimenopausal. They probably are going to menstruate for another 10 more years. The body doesn't start going through true menopause symptoms until you're 1 or 2 years before that.
Yeah, I'm 52 and I'm still, now that everything's back on track, I'm still menstruating.
Exactly. So you were going through
adrenal crash
impacting your hormones. You were going through an adrenal crash. It could have been a crash, or it could have been a hyper, I would have wanted to assess that more then, but, and sometimes what happens is you go into the over adrenal production and then you crash afterwards. But so that's kind of what I like to, explain to people, is that all of these hormones are so intricately related. You can't have one be off and the others not be affected. Right. So, and it's very common when there's stress for thyroid to take a dip. So, and that can usually cause weight gain. The other thing is when your adrenals, either if your cortisol is high cortisol will cause your body to produce more blood sugar or to secrete more blood sugar. It breaks down glycogen from the liver. So whether you've eaten or not, when your cortisol levels are high and you go into fight flight or you stay in fight flight, you're going to have elevated blood sugar. So we can start to get a disruption in the blood glucose pathway, which can also contribute to weight gain. Now, I didn't mention where. So glucose is typically the thing that holds the triangle up. So this is where diet and lifestyle really comes into keeping your hormones on track, is keeping your blood sugar balanced makes it a whole lot easier for that body to keep that thyroid in a stable place. If your blood sugar is doing this, it's very hard to regulate the other hormones. Because again, if you've got, if the thing holding something up is going all over the place, it's hard to keep those in a stable place. So those pieces are really important. And typically think about when we go through a high stress or we're triggered, we're not going to take as good of care of ourselves as we normally do, right? If you're
I couldn't even
you might
think,
go for
honestly.
food or you might
I
go
was
for
like,
wine.
what's going on? I was out of
you're
it.
all over the place. Your sleep, right? Your sleep gets disrupted. And so this will all have a major impact on blood sugar. And so that will also, contribute to some dysfunction or dysregulation of all three pieces of your, the top part of that triangle or the endocrine triangle. So, and this is really common. Again, I see this a lot in 40s. A lot of my patients are in that decade of life. They come in and they're like, I'm having hot flashes. I'm not sleeping. I've gained weight. And typically there is something going on with their thyroid, with their adrenals, and with their sex hormones. And so the way we kind of start to, obviously we want to test and see where things are, but we want to make sure that their lifestyle habits are in a good place, right? We want to make sure that, and I'm a huge fan of therapy. I have a really hard time working with patients that aren't getting some sort of regular therapeutic support because so many of our stressors are emotional triggers and sometimes they're unknown triggers, right? And sometimes it's hard to figure that out on your own. So I'm a really big fan of making sure my patients are getting consistent support. And sometimes that's from therapy. Sometimes that's from talking to their acupuncturist.
Sure.
They need somebody to be helping, holding space for them in that kind of emotional capacity.
I wanted to bring that up because yes, it is first of all, it's a super stressful world. It's the pace of, our modern world is, I think, totally unsustainable for people. If we buy into the fact that we're supposed to be answering these emails every day and answering these phone calls, it's just not possible. It just gets faster and faster and faster. So that's super stressful. But the piece about this past stress that can be kind of going on under the surface and then erupt in response to current stressors is definitely that's, what we're seeing in our practice all the time. And I feel like that's a very common situation for people in midlife, women in particular, but not only women. And we get this message culturally, again, if you're fat, it's your fault you're fat. If you're exhausted, you should be managing your stress better. If you're not getting enough sleep, take a pill. There's such a lack of connecting the way we feel to our bodies and what's actually happening in our bodies. And that's where this perspective is so helpful.
Yeah. And I think it's almost like a lack of like compassion almost. It's like, oh, if you're fat, it's your fault or if this, and yeah, and it's just like almost like, and I have a lot of wonderful friends who are, conventional medical practitioners, and it's not entirely their
that's
fault.
what they were taught.
Yeah. They don't have enough time that's what they were taught. Some of them, it was what they were taught, but they've now learned more, but they're in a model where they get 7 minutes for a follow-up. You can't unpack this kind of stuff in that kind of time, right?
True.
It takes
hundreds
me 7
of people
minutes
per
just
day. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. You have to see so many people a day and, to really, especially in the hormonal realm, there's so many intricacies. And like, the lab work that I order is, usually 7 to 10 pages long. It takes me a full hour to go over those results with the patient. And I really have found that when people understand what has gone off in their body and understand what we need to do to get things back, to a normal state, like when I teach them what meditation does, like what it actually does to the brain, what it does. And really cool fact is what I explained, those off buttons getting down regulated and that, the receptor in the hypothalamus. Meditation helps the body produce more of those receptors. So and we know meditation increases resiliency, but that's actually like the physiological resiliency is having those off buttons there, the ability to be able to turn off. And most of my patients, when they come in, they are stuck in fight flight, and they've tried meditating, they've tried relaxing. They can't relax because their brain right now is stuck in a pattern where it literally doesn't have the capability to physically turn off. So, what I love about natural medicine is there are herbs and homeopathics and some things that can also stimulate the body to make more of those off buttons. So we can give them enough so then they can actually, maybe actually start to relax in a meditative practice or a mindfulness practice or, whatever that practice might be that they're working with. So yeah. And I have a podcast as well, and I'm really big on my show every week. The message is whatever you're going through, make sure you're getting support, make sure you have someone like walking you through, and make sure it's someone that spends the time and is really going to help you figure out what's going on and teach you what's going on in your body and what you can do to get your body where you want it to be. And, again, support I think is so important, not only for a journey like this, but just for our nervous systems in general, right? Knowing that you have support is so beneficial.
That is so true. And it's so isolating when you go from feeling like a vital young person to such a rapid change. There's nothing wrong with the process of menopause. It's a natural thing, but it's not meant to happen on one day you're here and the next day you're in a completely different place. And it feels very isolating. Like, what's wrong with me? Why am I losing control of my body like this? And am I no longer, youthful and what I was, and the messages about that. It's that in itself is very isolating. So I appreciate what you said about the testing that you do. I know for myself, having the really in-depth testing, let's look at everything is like, and then like, this means this, and this means this, and this relates to this. And this is too high. This is too low. And here's how we can address it. It's empowering because people have, knowledge is power, and people have somebody taking the time to say, I care enough about you and your body to help you understand, and let's collaboratively develop a plan for you. So let's talk about in addition to meditation, herbs, homeopathics, what are some of the ways that you help people get these hormones? I know there's like a lot of variation, but getting their hormones back into balance.
So, it's going to start by figuring out where the imbalances are. But the majority of people I like to work on their adrenal function first. And lifestyle wise, that's going to look like making sure they're getting adequate rest. And if they're coming in and they're kind of stuck in that like tired and wired phase, they're not sleeping, they're agitated, they're up, their nervous system is kind of in that stuck being on place. We work on practicing relaxing. So that's like the number. I'm just like if you were to want to run a 10K and you're not a runner, you would not expect to wake up tomorrow and run 6 miles. You would run a little bit, a few times a week and slowly increase that. So, and I'll tell people, hey, I'm going to just have my favorite thing is to tell people to lay down for 10 minutes per day, no phone, nothing, and just get quiet. You can meditate if you want, but it's just, I call it getting horizontal. And I love for people to do it in the middle of the day. And so it's teaching the body, it's okay to calm down during the workday. We don't need to be stuck up in heightened fight flight all day long. So, and I'll tell them probably for the first 2 weeks, this is going to feel extremely uncomfortable. If you're going to be like, what am I doing? I should be doing something else. But you've got to, just like the first time you go for a run, if you're not a runner, it's going to be uncomfortable until you practice doing it. And the brain, the more that you practice and teach it, hey, it's okay for you to do this. It wants to work with you. So it will start to do that for you. So that's one of the main like lifestyle practices that I put into place. So again, I like to get people sleeping. So that's one of the big things we work on.
Is there a number that you tell people?
That's going to vary. I'm really big on making sure people are getting enough hours before midnight. So the hours before midnight are more beneficial so it's better to sleep from 10 to 6 than it is from 12 to 8, even though it's the same number of hours. It's more restorative for your circadian rhythm and for your adrenals to get even to go to bed at 11 and wake up at 7.
That's really good info.
We work on
that's really good info. I didn't know that.
Great information. Yeah. And this is more like, I learned this from Chinese medicine.
Mm-hmm.
In Chinese medicine, every hour of the clock has, it correlates to a different organ. And for the adrenals, you really need that before midnight sleep time. And so again, and if you're someone staying up late, we slowly work that bedtime back a little bit. So even if you're going to bed at 11:30, right, that's going to make, so baby steps. I'm big on baby steps. So getting sleep under control, and, we talk about sleep hygiene, getting electronics out of the bedroom, TVs out of the bedroom, stopping screen time before, a certain point before bed, baths, magnesium, all those things we can do to kind of get the body in a calm state. And this is really important because one of the things I didn't really touch on when I was talking about the adrenals is they are what control your circadian rhythm. So, and in the morning, our cortisol should be high. And as it goes throughout the day, our cortisol levels drop off, and they're at their lowest, right, usually around 10 p.m. on a normal circadian rhythm. And when cortisol is at its lowest, melatonin will be at its highest. They have direct opposing action. So if you're staring at a screen, right before you go to bed, blue light will stop the production of melatonin from the pineal gland. So, and when melatonin production is low, the body thinks, oh, melatonin is low, I probably should make cortisol. So it will up the cortisol. So it's really important to have this circadian rhythm going. I'm a huge fan of a small dose of melatonin before bed, even if it doesn't do anything to your sleep. Most of us spend a lot of time on screens, and so most of our melatonin production is not optimal. So a baby dose of melatonin can really help just reset those circadian rhythms. And then, we also talk about getting morning sunlight. So like trying to get outside without sunglasses, so have your eyes get sunlight before noon. So if you can get out, I know it's hard when it's gray, but if you can get outside, and I'm a huge fan of light boxes as well. So if you live in a place where it's gray and there isn't much sunlight or it's raining, use your light box in the morning, because that will tell the body, hey, I'm supposed to be making cortisol right now. I'm supposed to be. So again, all of this are tools to kind of get that circadian rhythm in check. And when that's in check, it's a lot easier to regulate the thyroid. It's a lot easier to regulate the sex hormones. So usually I like to start with that, that piece. And usually when my patients come in, they're going to have some dysfunction in all of these areas. So sometimes we might be doing a little bit of, like, if someone comes in and they're in a hypothyroid state, I'm going to treat their thyroid as well. And so usually I work with adrenals, and then we move into the thyroid realm. And oftentimes when those two are in a good place, the sex hormones kind of work themselves out, particularly in that 40s decade. Once we move into menopause, it's a little bit of a different story. But when you're in, 30s, 40s, when adrenals and thyroid are regulated and blood sugar is under control, the sex hormones, it's almost like people will be like, wow, my periods just went back to normal. I have no more PMS. This is fantastic. We didn't even do anything for that. And I find a lot of patients that were kind of trying to do things on their own. They're like, oh, well, I was taking this herb for estrogen progesterone balance, and I was doing this and it wasn't doing anything. And, and it was matching the symptoms. They're like, oh, well, it's showing like I have, I'm having like really bad PMS. Usually that means low progesterone, but I'm doing this thing, but they didn't address the adrenal piece. And so it's really hard to get the body to regulate the sex hormones if that circadian rhythm and adrenal piece isn't in a good place.
Yeah, that's a challenge, because there's so many things out there and you're like, oh, maybe this will make me feel better, but it's not a holistic approach. You're not looking at the whole situation. So you are really treating a symptom without seeing why is that symptom there, because
exactly.
you don't know.
And we were just saying earlier that we live in such a stressful time. It's really stressful to be, struggling with a health issue in today's time. There's so much information out there. If you're on social media, every influencer is like, well, take this and do this and do that. Or you get on Google and Google's like, do this or do that. It's like information overwhelm. And that itself can be really, really stressful, right? So again, this is why it's really important. And, I always share this on my podcast or with my patients. I have a naturopathic doctor. I have all this knowledge. I can't treat myself. I get really overwhelmed. I'm like, well, I have all these treatment therapies available and I can't see myself objectively. So when I have an issue, I call my doctor. I'm like, hey, can you help me walk through this and help, and I just try to pretend I don't know anything. Like, please help me figure this out. So it's, with this stuff, it's like this balance. You want to be empowered and you want to be knowledgeable and you want to know what's going on in your health, but it's really nice to have someone be like, hey, I'm looking at your case from over here. I can see the whole piece for all of the pieces. And here's what my recommendation is to move you from where you are to where you want to be.
Well, that's another example of, like you said, support. It's not.
Yes, exactly.
It's not about you have to figure it all out yourself. You have to solve this problem yourself. I can't let anyone know. It's only on me. You know what I mean? Versus like we're connected and we're meant to be connected.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we're going to find that, some aspects of how healing happens are related to the connection between, and it's not just like, who do you feel comfortable with, but that there is a healing in the connection between
100%. Yeah. That was one of the things where I loved my training so much. And we took a bunch of classes that talked about like just the therapeutic effect of sitting with a practitioner. And, I saw this woman, she was a homeopath. It's called their classical homeopath. All she did was homeopathy. And she would sometimes spend 2 hours taking a case, and she wouldn't even give the patient a remedy she would wait a while to decide what remedy, but oftentimes her patients would get much better within the first few days afterwards. And I see this with my patients too. I had someone message me actually yesterday. I saw her on Friday last week. And yesterday she's like, I feel like a new person. All of my symptoms are gone. This is amazing. These remedies must be amazing. And the remedies work. They don't usually work that quickly. Usually they take a few weeks. That for her, like she got so much value out of being listened to, out of me explaining what was going on. And, there's always a little bit of a placebo effect in anything that you do, right? Whether it's therapy or a medication or an herbal medicine. And the placebo effect is an amazing effect.
I know. I want to say maybe we should, look at what placebo really is. I'm like, differently instead of like, there's no treatment, but you just think you feel better. That's not what it is.
No, it's your brain. I mean, your brain's really, it's hope. And your brain is so powerful. If your brain believes it can get better, guess what? You're much more likely to get better. If your brain believes that a glass of water on the table has a magic elixir in it that's going to give you energy, it's much more likely that water is going to give you a little bit of energy versus if you tell your brain, wow, this water, it's got E. coli in it. Some people have such a strong placebo effect, they're going to get diarrhea after drinking that water, right? And I usually explain this to my patients. I'm like, let's play into the placebo effect. When you take your supplements, I want you to tell your brain, this is really helping me do this. I'm taking this for this reason. And then it almost amplifies the potency of whatever you're doing. Because
I love that.
Our brains control everything, right? Our brains, and I think we see this in the oncology world, patients that have an amazing attitude and they know they're going to get better, they get better, right? And there's research on that shows that a positive attitude actually improves your outcome. Yeah. And that's true in any sort of medicine. I mean, I can usually tell within the first 5 minutes, like whether a patient is going to improve quickly or if it's going to take a while, just by the way that they talk about their body and they talk about themselves. And, I do a lot of coaching with my patients when they work with me, because, if you're constantly saying things like my body is broken and it's working against me, and guess what? Your brain hears that. Your brain hears everything. It listens to your thoughts. It listens to, what you're telling it. It listens to what you're telling other people. Not that we can't, you need to be able to share what's going on and complain. But if your constant thought pattern is, I'm never going to get better. I'm never going to get better. And I see this with weight loss a lot, right? People are like, I can't lose weight. I can't lose weight. I can't lose weight. They say it over and over and over again. Well, I guess that's what their brain's going to hear. So we do a lot of coaching in our office to start to like shift those mindsets and shift the inner dialogue. So that makes a huge difference as well.
Yeah. And I believe that our systems are oriented towards wanting to heal. And at the same time, there can be like a negativity bias that can really, it's not like the person is causing it, but it's just like, it's a barrier to the healing that they're trying to achieve. And, yeah. So, but I love the beautiful, like, it's kind of an affirmation, like it's almost like manifesting. It's like, this will help me.
It is. It's like manifesting. Yeah, this will help me. And there's a certain percentage of the population that has like a higher, they're more susceptible to the placebo effect. And it has to do with how they produce and break down serotonin. So there's some genetic testing we can do, and I can find out, hey, you are more susceptible to the placebo effect. And if you have that, it's like, hey, you want to play into that. Everyone, the placebo effect works on everyone. But some people it works a little bit more. And, usually those people are called gullible or whatnot, but they have really powerful brains, right? Their brain is like that much more powerful over their physical healing, which is so cool, I think.
I think so too. And I think, more and more, we're just going to realize that people have so many gifts that may not be available to everyone, but just because those experiences, like, supposedly being gullible, but it's really having like a beneficial
an open mind. Yeah.
And a beneficial effect of hope, or of, belief in the potential. That's a good thing. So, well, Erin, I know that, you have recently, in addition to your practice, okay, so first of all, let's start off with, do you serve people in Maryland only?
No, I treat people all over the country.
Oh, great.
So we can do virtual consults and, I work with people all over the country. I feel like COVID really helped grow that aspect because it didn't really matter where, where you were.
Good, because our listeners are all over the country and all over the world, and there might be some people who have nobody in their area that they could work with.
Yeah, I would. So if you're listening and you're wanting to work with a naturopathic doctor, the best place to go is naturopathic.org, and you can type in your zip code and it'll list all of the licensed naturopathic doctors. If you want to work with someone who has the same degree that I have. And again, I'm happy to, either myself or I'm probably going to stop taking new patients here soon, but I have a colleague that I just brought on and she's fantastic and she does similar hormone work. And so you can call our office and schedule a free consult if you're interested.
Wonderful. And also maybe they can probably go on your website too. Like if they're international or something. Go on the website.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And then I also know from our conversation before we started recording that you've actually recently developed another way to make your work accessible. Can you tell a little bit about that before we finish?
Sure. So I just launched something called the Hormone Health Academy, where I dive deep into kind of stuff we're talking about today, adrenals, thyroid, and sex hormones. And it's a weekly call, a Zoom where I teach, and then we do a live Q&A, and it's membership based. And the goal of that is really, I get so many patients that call and they're like, I want to try to do this through conventional medicine, and I don't know what to ask for testing wise. I don't really know where to start. So I'm teaching, hey, here's the test you need to have run. Here's how to talk to your doctor about what's going on. Here's what you want to look for if you're looking for supplements. So I'm going to kind of help you navigate this and kind of give you some, place to start. If you're like, hey, I think things are off, I'm maybe not quite ready to make the investment to work with someone one-on-one and, without insurance, I can kind of teach you how you can start to see some impact, on your physical health, just by things at home or, working within the system that you're already in.
Well, that's so wonderful because, I mentioned how in our area, it's still kind of a smaller community who seeks out these types of services, but there are many places where people do not have that option in person,
Yes.
And, or maybe they live on a mountain and they would have to drive 5 hours, and being able to, get the information to be empowered and take their health back, is really valuable.
Yeah, it's really valuable. And again, what we've been talking about, I think it's really important to understand all of these, understand what's happening in your body hormonally, what's supposed to happen. So I teach, like, how is your body supposed to work? How are all these things supposed to work? And then what happens in these hormones when you get certain symptoms, and then how do we get you back to how it was supposed to be working?
Well, thank you. Thank you for what you're doing to educate people and to help people address these confusing, overwhelming challenges, and for coming here to my podcast today, to Therapy Chat, to share about it with our listeners. I'm so grateful.
Thank you for having me. This is a great conversation. Loved it.
Well, thank you. And Erin, what is your website where people can find all this good stuff?
Yep. So if you go to www.drerin, spelled DR and then erinkinney.com. And if you want to just go and learn a little bit more about me, I hang out a lot on Instagram at Dr. Kinney, and I've got videos and there's always stories. And you could also go check out my podcast, which is the Dr. Kinney Show. And we cover hormones and a lot more on that show.
Fabulous. Wonderful. Thank you again for being my guest today.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat with your host, Laura Reagan, lcsw-c. For more information, please visit therapychatpodcast.com.